After decades of silence, Ann-Margret, one of Hollywood's brightest stars, has finally broken her vow of secrecy about Elvis Presley. What did she reveal about their hidden bond? And why is the story so much more than a Hollywood romance? From private rehearsals to stolen moments that defied fame, every memory she shares uncovers truths the public never knew. Stay with us, because what she finally said about Elvis will leave you speechless. The confession she delayed for a lifetime. Silence was never an accident in Ann-Margret's life. At 85, when she finally allowed herself to speak with unguarded honesty, it was not because time had weakened her resolve, but because time had fulfilled its obligation. For decades, she had treated certain memories as sacred ground, places no interview question was allowed to step into. The decision to speak now came quietly, without spectacle, shaped by reflection rather than regret. What emerged was not gossip or nostalgia, but something far more deliberate. Age gave her a vantage point few ever reach. From that distance, Ann-Margret could see how every word she once withheld had been an act of care, not fear. She understood how easily truth can become spectacle when spoken too early. In Hollywood, especially during its most ruthless era, honesty could dismantle lives. She had watched it happen to others and vowed not to contribute to another public unraveling. Her silence was a form of guardianship, one she carried even when it cost her the chance to correct rumors that followed her for years. What makes her late-life confession striking is not what she revealed, but how she framed it. She did not speak as someone finally unburdening herself. Instead, she spoke like a steward returning something borrowed. The truth, she implied, never belonged to the public until the people it could harm were no longer vulnerable. This perspective runs counter to the modern appetite for instant disclosure. Her restraint was old Hollywood discipline mixed with personal loyalty, a code that demanded patience even when silence felt unfair. Behind the restraint was also timing shaped by loss. Ann-Margret waited until the noise around the story had faded, until Elvis had been mythologized beyond correction, and until those closest to him had built lives separate from the past. Only then could truth exist without becoming a weapon. Her words were careful, measured, and stripped of embellishment. They carried no intent to rewrite history, only to clarify the emotional reality behind it. The confession also reflected how she understood legacy. Ann-Margret was acutely aware that everything said late in life becomes part of the historical record. She wanted her final contribution to be rooted in dignity rather than drama. That meant refusing to sensationalize moments that tabloids had long exaggerated. Instead of confirming myths, she dismantled them quietly, replacing fantasy with something more human and far more complex. There was also an unexpected tenderness in how she spoke about restraint itself. She acknowledged the personal cost of keeping silent, the misunderstandings that followed her career, and the assumptions made about her choices. Yet, she never expressed resentment. In her view, silence had been the price of protecting something fragile. Speaking too soon would have reduced it to rumor. Speaking too late would have erased it entirely. She chose the narrow window where truth could exist without cruelty. This opening truth reframes confession as responsibility rather than release. Ann-Margret did not wait because she was afraid. She waited because she believed some stories require distance to be told honestly. At 85, she was no longer performing for cameras or shaping her image. She was speaking as a witness who had finally judged the moment safe enough for truth to breathe. But if this was only the moment she chose to speak, what kind of woman was she before the world ever linked her name to Elvis Presley? And what unseen forces were already shaping her path toward that collision of destinies? Stay with us as the mystery deepens. The woman fate was preparing. Long before her name was ever spoken in the same breath as Elvis Presley, Ann-Margret was already in motion, shaped by forces far removed from Hollywood sound stages and studio contracts. Born in Sweden and raised partly in a working-class immigrant household in the United States, her early life was defined by discipline rather than glamour. Music lessons were not indulgences but commitments. Dance was not a hobby, but a language she learned to speak fluently before she ever understood its power. By the time she reached adolescence, performance was not a dream she chased. It was a skill she was sharpening with quiet urgency. Her path into entertainment did not follow the familiar studio-manufactured ascent. Ann-Margret earned her footing through relentless preparation, training her voice, her movement, and her physical stamina with a seriousness uncommon among aspiring actresses of the era. She studied music theory, immersed herself in jazz rhythms, and developed a stage presence that was both controlled and explosive. Those who saw her perform early described something difficult to categorize. She was neither ingenue nor vamp. She commanded attention without demanding it, a trait that would later unsettle even the most established stars. Hollywood noticed her not because she fit a mold, but because she disrupted one. Studio executives initially struggled to place her. She was musical, but not decorative, sensual, but not submissive, charismatic without being chaotic. At a time when female performers were carefully boxed into predictable archetypes, Ann-Margret refused to settle into any single category. This ambiguity made her risky, but it also made her magnetic. Audiences sensed it immediately, even when executives hesitated. Her early screen tests revealed another crucial difference. Ann-Margret did not perform at the camera. She seemed to perform through it. There was an intensity in her gaze, a physical confidence that suggested she was fully aware of her presence and unafraid of it. This quality set her apart from many actresses groomed to soften themselves for mass appeal. She did not shrink to be palatable. She expanded, and the frame adjusted around her. Behind the scenes, she was equally formidable. Ann-Margret was known for arriving prepared, knowing her material, and pushing herself beyond what was asked. Directors noticed that she treated rehearsals as laboratories, experimenting with movement and rhythm until something authentic emerged. Musicians respected her because she understood tempo and phrasing. Dancers admired her stamina. She was not chasing approval. She was building command. This foundation mattered because it shaped how she would later be perceived. When she eventually crossed paths with Elvis, she would not encounter him as a wide-eyed admirer or a manufactured counterpart. She would meet him as someone already forged by effort, already carrying her own gravity. That balance of power would become central to everything that followed. Another lesser-known aspect of her pre-Elvis years was her internal restraint. Despite rapid success, Ann-Margret was cautious about exposure. She avoided excess publicity, guarded her private life, and resisted being consumed by Hollywood's appetite. This instinct for self-protection was not taught by studios. It was learned through observation. She watched careers flare and collapse under pressure, and she made a quiet decision to move differently. By the early 1960s, she stood at a rare intersection. She was young, visible, and rising, yet not yet defined by any single narrative. Studios saw potential. Audiences sensed depth. Critics struggled to summarize her appeal in a single sentence. She was becoming a force, but one still unclaimed by mythology. That moment of openness, when her identity was still unfolding, was precisely when fate intervened. Because when Ann-Margret finally stepped onto the set where her path would intersect with Elvis Presley, she did not arrive as a supporting presence. She arrived as a fully formed equal, carrying years of discipline, ambition, and quiet resolve into a collision no script could fully anticipate. And once that spark ignited, nothing about either of their lives would remain untouched. So what happened when two carefully built worlds finally collided under the glare of studio lights? And why did that first encounter change the energy of everyone in the room? Come with us to explore the hidden corners of the story. Viva Las Vegas and the spark no script could contain. The first day on the Viva Las Vegas set was nothing short of electric. Ann-Margret had stepped in with a reputation for precision and presence, but Elvis brought a magnetism that even the most disciplined performers struggled to navigate. When their eyes met across the soundstage, it was more than a greeting. It was a moment that shifted the atmosphere. Crew members later described an unspoken current, a tension that neither dialogue nor choreography could contain. Something alive had sparked, one that would ripple through every scene they filmed together. From the opening dance rehearsals, it became clear that their connection was more than professional. They moved in tandem with an intuition that seemed instinctive, almost preternatural. Each improvisation, each subtle gesture, revealed an understanding that went beyond memorized steps. Directors initially chalked it up to raw talent, but those who worked closely could sense something deeper. The pair fed off each other's energy in ways that elevated the entire production, making performances feel spontaneous even when they were meticulously planned. Off-camera, the intensity continued in quiet moments. Lunch breaks became a space of shared jokes and private laughter, of stories exchanged between takes. Yet there was always a boundary, an unspoken code. Neither pushed too far, but both tested limits in subtle ways. From stolen glances to inside references only the other would catch. It was in these small, fleeting interactions that the emotional dependence began to take shape. What the cameras captured was dazzling. What the cameras could not see was far more intimate and fragile. The music itself seemed to take on new life. Ann-Margret's voice had a playful strength that harmonized effortlessly with Elvis's style. And in certain numbers, their rhythm created an almost tangible chemistry. Observers noted that scenes intended to be purely entertaining carried a heat and depth that had not been in the original choreography. The result was cinematic magic, but also a mirror of a connection neither had fully anticipated nor wanted to define too quickly. Yet amidst the glitter and excitement, there was also the shadow of discretion. Both were aware of the boundaries imposed by the studio, the media, and the lives they led outside the set. In every public rehearsal and press photo, professionalism remained visible. In private, there was a rare vulnerability. Elvis showed moments of doubt about fame and performance, and Ann-Margret responded with steadiness and empathy, offering a quiet refuge from the unrelenting demands of Hollywood life. Their emotional partnership, though invisible to outsiders, became essential to their work and increasingly to their personal survival. Even small gestures carried weight: a touch on a shoulder, a shared look during a complicated number, a whispered encouragement. All became a silent language, a shorthand that allowed them to communicate more truth than words could convey. Crew members who noticed this dynamic later admitted it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. There was no chaos, only a controlled intensity that drew attention while remaining unseen by the world. It was this collision of talent, instinct, and unspoken emotion that transformed Viva Las Vegas into more than a film. It became a crucible, testing both personal limits and professional integrity. Neither had intended for their private world to grow so complex, yet the fire between them could not be ignored. Each day they returned to the set, the uncharted chemistry demanded acknowledgement, yet remained carefully contained. It was an invisible contract between two people caught between desire and decorum, artistry and secrecy. And as their final dance rehearsals concluded and the first shots rolled, the question lingered: what happens when a connection this electric can never be fully expressed, yet refuses to be hidden? Let us guide you into what no one expected. Loving the king inside a golden cage. Once the cameras stopped rolling, a different reality emerged, one far more complicated than any script could capture. Elvis Presley's world was one of rigid control. Managers, studio executives, and publicists dictated every movement, every appearance. Even the smallest slip could become headline news. Yet within this gilded cage, Ann-Margret discovered a side of Elvis that few ever saw. Away from the public eye, he was not an untouchable icon, but a man who craved understanding and comfort, someone who relied on her steadiness in ways no one else could provide. Their interactions shifted subtly into private sanctuaries, quiet corners of hotel suites, late-night rehearsals, and secluded lounges where expectations loosened and the intensity of their bond could breathe. Elvis, though commanding on stage, revealed insecurities in these moments, a longing for connection that transcended fame, a vulnerability that was often masked by charisma. Ann-Margret did not exploit this. Instead, she became a confidant, a partner in navigating a world where spontaneity was rare and privacy even rarer. Yet maintaining these stolen moments came at a cost. The studio had its rules and the press had its gaze. Their friendship, and the emotions that quietly threaded through it, was constantly at risk of exposure. They had to communicate in gestures, half-smiles, and coded jokes. Each meeting was a delicate balance between genuine affection and calculated discretion. A misplaced comment could spark speculation, a glance could be misread. Every interaction carried weight, every silence was deliberate. The more time they spent together, the clearer it became that their connection was sustaining them. Elvis's charm often masked the exhaustion beneath the showmanship, and Ann-Margret's energy and discipline gave him a rare sense of stability. In private rehearsals, she could challenge him, push him creatively, and coax a vulnerability that translated into unmatched performances. Their professional brilliance intertwined with personal support, creating a synergy that neither had anticipated, but both depended on. Their relationship was never reckless, but it was profoundly human. It existed in the delicate space between devotion and restraint. Ann-Margret observed the strains of fame on him, pressure to perform, expectations of perfection, and constant scrutiny from fans and family alike. She recognized the emotional toll and understood that her presence offered more than companionship. It was a sanctuary, a buffer from the relentless demands of stardom. Even small gestures carried significance. A shared laugh over a forgotten line, a silent nod during a challenging dance routine, a reassuring touch before a performance. Each was a lifeline. These private moments became the core of their bond, invisible to the outside world but intensely real. They were not a rebellion against the rules, but a quiet defiance against isolation, a claim to a private truth in a life otherwise dictated by public expectation. And while the outside world assumed the story of Elvis was one of charisma and conquests, Ann-Margret witnessed the private reality, a man seeking authenticity amidst the illusion. Their connection was not a headline, not a scandal. It was an emotional refuge, a sanctuary carved in the margins of celebrity. But if this bond offered sanctuary, what boundaries would eventually strain under the pressure of duty, jealousy, and personal obligations? And when love existed in secrecy, how could it survive in a world that demanded public proof? Stay tuned as the next twist unfolds. The love that could not win. Even the strongest bonds face the limits imposed by life outside the sanctuary. For Ann-Margret and Elvis, the boundaries were not just social, they were contractual, familial, and psychological. The glow of private connection had to contend with the glare of public expectation. By the time the cameras stopped for Viva Las Vegas, the intensity they shared was undeniable, yet it existed in a delicate state of suspension. Their unspoken understanding had flourished in quiet spaces, but the outside world demanded allegiance, loyalty, and appearances that neither could fully evade. Priscilla Presley's presence loomed in ways both overt and subtle. Though the studio rarely allowed personal lives to bleed into professional settings, whispers always found their way into the press and the corridors of Hollywood. Elvis, bound by the promise of commitment, was caught between two worlds, one defined by legal and moral obligations, the other by a rare and profound emotional intimacy. Ann-Margret, fully aware of the stakes, learned to navigate this tension with grace and discretion. Her admiration for him was matched by a conscious restraint, a knowledge that desire alone could not justify the potential fallout. Their moments together became ever more fleeting. Late-night rehearsals gave way to brief encounters on empty stages. Whispered jokes during scene changes turned into hurried glances as studio executives monitored activity. Each private gesture carried the weight of necessity, an urgency masked by care. In these fleeting interactions, however, the emotional dependence only deepened. Both understood the unspoken truth. What they had could not survive in the open without altering or destroying it. They were tethered by connection, yet confined by circumstance. The emotional tension extended beyond romantic longing. Jealousy, while never outwardly aggressive, was a constant undercurrent. Ann-Margret, who had cultivated her career on precision and independence, experienced a conflict she had never faced before. Loving someone who could never fully claim her required patience, discipline, and the courage to accept incompleteness. Similarly, Elvis struggled to reconcile his loyalty with his private needs. His vulnerability, which had been so easily shared behind closed doors, could not emerge publicly without dire consequences. This constant negotiation of feeling and duty created an invisible strain that neither could fully articulate. Studio control added another layer of complexity. Executives and publicists, while often enamored of both stars, enforced a rigid script for personal appearances and media coverage. Every photograph, every public statement was curated to preserve the image of Elvis as the untouchable king, and Ann-Margret as the rising starlet, a pairing of glamour rather than emotional truth. This artificial lens forced both of them to perform, even when their hearts were fully engaged elsewhere. Acting, rehearsing, and smiling on camera became exercises in discipline rather than authentic expression, highlighting the stark difference between what the public could see and the reality that existed in private. Amid the constraints, guilt became another constant companion. Both wrestled with the moral weight of a relationship that could never be fully acknowledged. Ann-Margret, known for her assertive energy and fierce independence, confronted a version of herself defined by restraint and sacrifice. She had to reconcile the exhilaration of connection with the ethical reality that love, no matter how compelling, could not justify crossing boundaries that would hurt others. For Elvis, the tension was equally acute. His devotion to Priscilla was genuine, yet the companionship, understanding, and laughter he found with Ann-Margret filled a void his public life could never satisfy. These contradictions created a bond that was intense, necessary, and heartbreaking all at once. The emotional landscape they navigated was rarely linear. Moments of tenderness alternated with pangs of longing, laughter was shadowed by awareness, and private intimacy coexisted with public invisibility. Both became experts at compartmentalizing, storing memories carefully while continuing to perform the roles demanded by the world around them. The private world they built was never frivolous. It was essential. And yet, the most profound aspect of this connection lay in its quiet power. Neither sought to dominate the other, neither aimed to disrupt the larger structures of their lives. Instead, their relationship existed as a subtle assertion of humanity, a testament to what two people can find in each other even when external forces refuse to acknowledge it. In every hurried glance, every shared laugh behind closed doors, there was a declaration that emotional truth could exist without public validation. Despite its intensity, the relationship could not alter the inevitable. Duty, expectations, and circumstance ultimately shaped the course of their lives more than desire ever could. Ann-Margret's career continued to rise. Elvis's public persona remained sacrosanct, and the constraints around them solidified. Their love, brilliant and alive, became a study in restraint and loyalty, an enduring connection that demanded sacrifice and careful negotiation at every step. By the time the film wrapped, both understood the impossibility of openly pursuing what they felt. Their connection would remain a private narrative, preserved in glances, gestures, and memories, rather than headlines or photographs. The love that had sparked so vividly, illuminated so intensely, existed most fully in the shadows. It was a love defined not by conquest, but by patience, discretion, and devotion, a paradox of presence and absence, passion and restraint. And as the reality of duty and loyalty pressed down on them, one question remained. How could a bond this profound endure when it could never be fully acknowledged? And what shape would it take once the lights went out forever? Stay with us as the secrets grow even darker. A bond that outlived fame, distance, and death. After the final curtain fell and the cameras were packed away, the world assumed that the story of Elvis and Ann-Margret had ended with separation, career demands, and the inexorable passage of time. What the public did not see was a bond that had transformed into something far more enduring than romance, a connection that survived the distance between coasts, the relentless pace of stardom, and the private sorrows that fame often brings. Ann-Margret, in particular, carried the weight of this relationship quietly, translating it into loyalty that would outlast the glittering chaos of Hollywood. Even as Elvis's fame intensified, he faced pressures that few could comprehend. Touring schedules became grueling, health issues crept into his daily life, and public expectation demanded an unyielding performance of perfection. Ann-Margret, while pursuing her own thriving career, remained a steady point of emotional reference in her memory. Though years had placed physical space between them, the shared understanding they had cultivated, the silent language of gestures, subtle jokes, and mutual respect remained intact. This invisible tether gave her a clarity that few outsiders could grasp. Love, in its truest form, could exist without constant contact, proof, or public acknowledgement. In the years following Viva Las Vegas, their lives moved in parallel, yet separate orbits. Ann-Margret embraced roles that demanded versatility and grit, carving a reputation as one of Hollywood's most disciplined and compelling performers. She thrived on challenges that tested her craft, yet she carried private reflections of the man who had so profoundly shaped her emotional world. Elvis, meanwhile, battled the toll of relentless performance and personal struggles, the pressures of fame sometimes overwhelming even his charisma. In these decades apart, neither forgot the sanctuary they had once created together, a refuge where vulnerability was safe, laughter was shared without performance, and understanding needed no words. The loss of Elvis in 1977 crystallized the permanence of her silence and the depth of her loyalty. The world mourned a public icon, but for Ann-Margret, grief was intensely personal. It was not the loss of a fleeting romance. It was the disappearance of a connection that had offered emotional sanctuary, companionship, and understanding that transcended ordinary intimacy. Her reflection on their time together, decades later, was careful and deliberate, as if she were guarding not just memories, but a sacred truth about human connection under extraordinary circumstances. This bond was remarkable because it did not rely on spectacle or public display. Unlike other celebrity relationships chronicled in tabloids, their connection survived precisely because it was not performative. It was shaped by discretion, tempered by the realities of their lives, and strengthened by a shared understanding that some truths are too precious to expose to the world. Ann-Margret's recollections, late in life, illuminate a love defined not by headlines or drama, but by emotional fidelity, mutual respect, and enduring loyalty. Even decades later, Ann-Margret reflects on the private, unspoken depth of her bond with Elvis, revealing his humanity and her steadfast loyalty. Their connection transcended conventional romance, surviving fame, distance, and time. At 85, she acknowledged that their love had evolved into lifelong devotion and cherished memory, proving that the deepest relationships often flourish quietly, away from public scrutiny. Were you shocked by the truths Ann-Margret revealed about her connection with Elvis Presley and the emotional depth behind the Hollywood legend? Share with us which part surprised you the most.